Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought anything truly terrifying would happen to me. Horror stories were something I enjoyed in books and movies, not in my actual life. But that changed when I moved into my new apartment in 2017. It was a small studio in an old building, the kind that creaks in the night and has questionable plumbing. I didn't mind. It was cheap, close to work, and most importantly mine. But from the very first night, I felt something was off. The feeling wasn't immediate dread, just an occasional sensation that I wasn't alone. At first I chalked it up to paranoia, a side effect of living alone for the first time. The building made noises, old wood shifting, pipes groaning, but there was one sound that stood out from the rest. At night, I would hear faint rustling coming from the vents. I assumed it was rats. That was bad, but not terrifying. I told the landlord, who waved it off, saying, "It's an old place, you'll get used to it." So I did my best to ignore it. A few nights later, I woke up feeling watched. My studio was dark, except for the streetlights seeping through the curtains. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, but everything was as it should be. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate exhale, coming from the vent. I sat up in bed, staring at the metal grate. My breath caught in my throat. Was it my imagination? The wind? I tried to tell myself anything that would make sense, but as I strained to listen, I heard it again. A breath, slow and controlled, like someone was trying not to be heard. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I unscrewed the vent cover. My hands trembled as I peered inside. It was dark and smelled faintly of mildew and rust. I used my phone flashlight but could only see metal tunnels stretching into the shadows. There was nothing immediately there. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I convinced myself of that, until a few nights later, I had just turned off the lights when I heard it. Scraping, a slow, dragging movement. My blood ran cold. I turned my head toward the vent, heart hammering. Then, a whisper. It was so faint I almost doubted it, but then it came again. A raspy voice, just barely audible. "I see you." I flew out of bed and bolted out of my apartment, shaking so hard I could barely unlock my phone to call the police. When they arrived, they checked the vents in my apartment thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. I was losing my mind, I thought. Then, 2 days later, my downstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She was pale, her hands gripping the door frame tightly. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "Why?" She looked over her shoulder nervously, then whispered, "I swear I heard someone crawling inside the walls." My stomach dropped. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the vent, waiting for something to happen. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Movement, and this time I wasn't going to ignore it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it directly into the vent. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but then something moved. Eyes, wide, bloodshot eyes staring right back at me from inside the vent. I screamed and fell back, scrambling toward the door. The eyes vanished, followed by rapid scraping noises, as if whoever, or whatever, was retreating. I ran to my landlord's unit, banging on his door until he opened up. I told him everything. He looked at me with an unreadable expression before sighing and rubbing his temples. "Call the cops," he muttered, grabbing his coat. Now, the police arrived quickly this time. When they removed the vent cover and shone their lights inside, they found something I still have nightmares about. A man, a gaunt, filthy man, had been living inside the ventilation system. They pulled him out, kicking and screaming, his nails broken and fingertips bloody from crawling through the metal ducts. His clothes were shredded, his hair matted. He had been living there for who knows how long, sneaking into apartments when people weren't home, watching through the grates at night. They found a small hole behind one of the old cabinets in my kitchen that led into a narrow maintenance passage connecting the vents to the basement. He had made a nest there, along with a collection of stolen items from various apartments. The police arrested him, and I moved out immediately. I still can't sleep without checking every vent in any place I live, because now, I know sometimes the sounds in the night aren't just the building settling. Sometimes someone is watching, The disappearing house. I grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone.
What is why?
It was quiet, safe, the kind of town where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. But there was one place everyone avoided, the house at the end of Holloway Road. No one knew who built it. No one knew who owned it. It had just always been there. A two-story Victorian with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The windows were always dark, and no cars ever parked in the overgrown driveway. The house wasn't abandoned exactly, but it felt wrong, like it was waiting for something.
One summer when I was 13,
my friends and I dared each other to go inside. We had spent years making up ghost stories about the house, but none of us had ever actually set foot past the front gate. That night, armed with flashlights and teenage bravado, we climbed over the rusted fence and made our way to the front door. It was unlocked. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside. The house was strangely empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just endless dark rooms and long hallways that seemed to stretch further than the house should allow. We split up, our voices echoing off the empty walls. I wandered into what must have been the living room, my flashlight beam flickering across faded wallpaper, and then I saw it. A picture frame, still hanging on the wall. It was the only thing in the entire house.
Wow.
The photo inside was yellowed and faded, but I could still make out the figures. A family of 4 standing on the very porch we had just walked across, but their faces were wrong, blurred, distorted, as if something had melted their features away. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to call my friends, but the words died in my throat. The house was changing. The hallway I had come through was no longer there. In its place was another door, slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something move in the shadows, a figure, tall and thin, watching me. I screamed and ran blindly through the house, crashing into walls, doors, anything to get away. I heard my friends yelling my name from somewhere far away, but their voices sounded warped, distant. Then just as suddenly as it started, I burst through the front door and onto the porch. My friends were already outside, their faces pale. "What the hell happened to you?" one of them asked. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house stood there, silent and dark, just as it always had, but something was different. The front door was gone. We ran. We never spoke about that night again, not really. But the next day when we passed by Holloway Road, the house wasn't there anymore. It had disappeared. An empty lot sat where it should have been, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken wood and debris, as if the house had been abandoned for decades. But we knew better. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting. Years passed and I moved away for college, eager to leave my small town and its lingering ghosts behind. But no matter how far I went, I could never forget that night, or the way the house had simply vanished. Then one evening, I got a call from my childhood friend Daniel, the same one who had been with me that night. His voice was shaking. "Dude, it's back." At first I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He sent me a photo, Holloway Road, same as it had always been. But now, standing where the empty lot had been for years, was the house. It looked exactly the same. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the dark windows, as if it had never been gone. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to my hometown the next weekend, meeting Daniel near the lot. It was real. The house was back, and I could feel the same wrongness I had felt years ago, creeping into my bones. "I saw someone inside," Daniel whispered, "in the upstairs window. We should have left, but something about the house pulled us in again, just like before. This time the front door wasn't unlocked. It was wide open. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the dust-heavy air. The same emptiness greeted us, but something felt different. I turned toward the living room, half expecting to see the strange photograph still hanging there. It was, but the image had changed. The family was still there, but now, there were 5 people in the picture. Daniel and I stared at it, our stomachs twisting in fear. The 5th figure stood slightly behind the family, its face blurred beyond recognition. Then as we watched, the photo flickered, like a glitching screen, and the 5th figure moved. A slow, jerky motion. It was turning toward us. We bolted. We didn't stop running until we were back in Daniel's car, breathless and shaking. As we sped away, I dared to look back. The house was gone. Again, neither of us ever returned to Holloway Road after that. But sometimes I dream of it, and in those dreams, the house is waiting, and the fifth figure is watching. Part 1. The map that shouldn't exist. It started with a simple road trip. James and his best friend, Mark, had spent the past year planning their perfect escape, just the two of them. A truck full of supplies and miles of open road. They had no destination, just a desire to explore the forgotten places of America. One evening, while passing through rural Pennsylvania, they stopped at an old gas station off a nearly deserted highway. The attendant was an elderly man, with cloudy eyes, sitting in a chair behind the counter, watching a tiny black and white TV that flickered in it. Out of static. Y'all heading anywhere in particular? The man rasped, barely looking up. Nope, just exploring, James replied, grabbing a worn-out map from a shelf. He wasn't sure why he even needed one. His phone had GPS, but something about the old paper intrigued him. Mark leaned over, peering at the faded lines and dots. What's this town? He pointed to a small unmarked location labeled Dunridge. The old man's eyes darkened. He stood slowly and reached across the counter, yanking the map from James's hands. That town ain't there, the man said flatly. Mark raised an eyebrow. It's right here on me. I said it ain't there. James and Mark exchanged an amused glance. But the man wasn't joking. He folded the map, shoved it into James's hands and whispered, "You best be careful where you wander." Feeling a chill in the air, they nodded and left. But once back in the truck, curiosity won. What do you think? Quick detour. Mark grinned. James hesitated, then shrugged. Why not? They didn't realize that decision would cost them everything. Part 2. The road to nowhere. Following the map, they turned onto an overgrown road that wasn't listed on Google Maps. No street signs, no mile markers, just a narrow, cracked pavement path that disappeared into thick, looming trees. Weird, Mark muttered, eyes scanning the darkening woods. Feels like we're driving into a horror movie. James chuckled nervously, but kept going. The road wound through dense forest for miles. No lights, no houses, no sign of civilization. Yet the map insisted Dunridge was just ahead. Then suddenly, street lights, dimmed, flickering bulbs lined the road, casting eerie yellow glows on old wooden buildings. They had arrived. Dunridge looked frozen in time. The storefronts were outdated, cars rusted along the curbs, and the sidewalks were no people, no movement, just an unnatural stillness. Mark checked his phone. No signal. James pulled the truck to a stop. Let's check it out. As they stepped outside, the air felt heavy, like walking through unseen cobwebs. The silence was suffocating. No birds, no wind, just their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. A diner sat on the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Open 24 hours. They stepped inside. Part 3. The people who shouldn't be there. The diner's interior was straight out of the 1950s. A jukebox hummed a tune James didn't recognize. Vinyl booths lined the walls, and behind the counter stood a waitress in an old-fashioned uniform, staring blankly at them. Hi, Mark said. The woman didn't blink. James cleared his throat. Sorry if we're intruding. You shouldn't be here. Her voice was eerily flat. Mark shifted uncomfortably. We just saw the town on a map, and the map lies. James felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Then the bell above the diner door jingled. They turned. A man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. He had no expression, no emotion in his cold, glassy eyes. Behind him, more figures began appearing outside. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, staring at them. The waitress's voice dropped to a whisper. You have to leave. Mark grabbed James's arm. We should go. They turned to leave. But the door was now locked. The suited man stepped forward. You shouldn't have come. The windows darkened, as if something outside had swallowed the light. Shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping across the walls. The jukebox began to warp, its music distorting into a garbled mess of static and whispers. James's heartbeat pounded in his ears. What the hell is this place? Mark grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. It didn't break. The waitress backed away, fear finally surfacing on her face. They don't let outsiders leave. The suited man took another step, and the shadows at his feet writhed, moving against the floor like living tendrils. Run. Part 4. The escape. That wasn't. James and Mark bolted for the back door. They crashed into the alley, sprinting toward their truck. The street was now lined with silent figures, their empty eyes following. James yanked the door handle, locked. Mark cursed. Keys, keys. Then a whisper slithered through the air. Too late. The truck's headlights flickered. Then, its engine roared to life, but neither of them had touched it. The truck reversed on its own, speeding backward down the road and vanishing into the night. No, no, James screamed. Footsteps approached. The suited man was only a few feet away now. The shadows beneath him pulsed, spreading toward them. Mark grabbed James's wrist. Run. They sprinted down the street, but the town was changing. Buildings twisted and stretched. Roads coiled like snakes. No matter which way they ran, they always ended up back in the center of town. The crowd of silent figures grew. Hundreds now. Their whispers melded into one unnatural chorus. You are part of us now. Mark clutched his head. James, I can't think. James grabbed him. We have to get out. But there was no exit, only darkness swallowing everything. Then, the suited man raised his hand, and everything went black. Part 5. The Aftermath. James woke up in a hospital bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Birds chirped. A nurse noticed he was awake and rushed over. You're okay, she said. You were found on the side of the highway. James's head ached. What happened? Where's Mark? The nurse's expression faltered. Who? James's blood turned to ice. Mark, my friend. We were in Dunridge. She frowned. Sir, there is no Dunridge. James tried to argue, but the moment he said the name, a sharp pain lanced through his skull. The nurse watched with concern. Just rest, she said softly. James lay back, but he knew the truth. There was a Dunridge. They had gone there. They had seen the town. But now, it was as if Mark had never existed. And in the darkest corners of his mind, James swore he could still hear the whispers. The rain had been falling for hours, a steady rhythm against the roof of the old house. It was a sound that should have been soothing, a lullaby against the silence of the night. But for Emma, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, it was nothing more than a reminder that she was trapped. The house belonged to her grandmother, an old Victorian estate, deep in the countryside. It had been abandoned for years, ever since her grandmother passed. Now, after years of neglect, it stood alone, forgotten, with its peeling wallpaper and hollowed-out rooms filled with dust and echoes of the past. Emma had come here to sort through the remains of a life she barely remembered. Her mother refused to step foot in the That house was never right, she had said. Not when I was a girl, not now. Emma had brushed off her warnings. The house was just that. A house, walls, a roof, memories, nothing more. But now, as the rain poured outside and the wind howled through the trees, she wasn't so sure. It wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was the sound coming from above. At first, she thought it was the wind, a faint creaking, like old wood shifting under the pressure of the storm. But then it happened again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate movement, as if something heavy was shifting in the attic above her room. Emma held her breath, listening, a dragging sound. She sat up. The house had been empty for years, hadn't it? Maybe an animal had found its way inside, a raccoon or a stray cat. Then,
thump.
Something dropped directly above her, shaking the ceiling. Emma's skin prickled. That wasn't an animal. She reached for her phone, activating the flashlight as she climbed out of bed. Her bare feet pressed against the cold wooden floor. As she stepped cautiously into the hallway, the attic door was at the end of the hall, a small square opening in the ceiling, with a wooden pull-down lid. It was closed. She stared at it, her heart pounding. No, it had to be an animal, maybe a loose branch hitting the roof. Shaking her head, she turned back to bed, but just as she closed her door, thump, 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 a slow, deliberate knocking from inside the attic. Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds above. The thumping, the dragging, the occasional knock. By morning, the noises had stopped. Determined to find the source, she retrieved a flashlight and made her way to the attic door. Dust covered the pull string. It hadn't been touched in years. She hesitated, then pulled. The ladder creaked as it unfolded. A stale, musty scent drifted down from above, thick with dust, and Emma pulled. The attic was dark, the wooden beams stretching like ribs in a forgotten skeleton. Boxes lay scattered, untouched, their labels faded. Old furniture stood like silent sentinels, draped in white sheets.
She swept the flashlight across the space. Nothing. No sign of animals. No loose boards. Then why had it sounded like something was moving? She took a step forward and froze. In the farthest corner beneath the lowest part of the slanted roof, something was there. A shape. Barely visible in the dim light. A bed. An old iron-framed bed, covered in a rotting mattress, and someone was lying in it. Emma's breath hitched. The figure beneath the sheets didn't move. It couldn't be real. No one had been in this house for years. It had to be a trick of the light, a forgotten mannequin, a pile of old blankets. She took a cautious step closer. The air around the bed was cold, freezing. The dust on the floor was disturbed, forming faint erratic trails, as if something had crawled there. Emma's flashlight flickered. The shape beneath the sheets shifted. A slow, rattling breath filled the attic. Emma stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging her into darkness. And then, a whisper, so close, right beside her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Emma fled the attic, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She wanted to leave, wanted to get in her car and drive away and never look back. But the storm had flooded the roads. She was trapped. By nightfall the house felt heavier, as if it were waiting. She locked her bedroom door, placed a chair beneath the handle, pulled the covers up to her chin, and squeezed her eyes shut. The rain beat against the windows, the wind howled through the trees, and then, from the attic, thump. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to move. Thump, thump, slow, deliberate, and then, the creak of the attic door opening. Terror wrapped around her like a vice. She listened, every muscle in her body rigid. Something stepped onto the landing. Not an animal, not a branch. Footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps, moving toward her room. The chair against the door shuddered. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, forcing herself not to scream. The handle rattled, and then, the whisper, "Let me in." The house that watches morning came, pale and cold. The storm had passed. The roads were clear. Emma didn't waste time. She grabbed her keys, threw open the front door, and froze. On the porch, outside her bedroom window, the chair she had placed beneath her door handle sat perfectly upright, as if someone had moved it, as if someone had wanted to let themselves in. She never stepped foot in that house again. She never told her mother what happened, but sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the world is quiet, and the rain taps against her apartment window, she swears she still hears it. The whisper, right outside her door, "Let me in." The waves lapped gently against the shore, their steady rhythm whispering an ancient lullaby to the quiet world. The sky was a deep, endless navy, speckled with stars that shimmered like distant lanterns. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the moon cast a silver path across the water, illuminating the lonely lighthouse that stood upon the cliffs. The Black Ridge Lighthouse had stood there for over a century, its beams slicing through the darkness, a silent guardian of the sea. Few people knew its history, and fewer still had ever spoken to the man who kept it. But he was there, an old man named Samuel Greaves, the last lighthouse keeper, and he had a secret. A night like any other, inside the lighthouse, the warmth of the crackling fire filled the cozy space, its glow flickering against the aged wooden walls. The scent of sea salt lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of old books and candle wax. Samuel sat in his chair, his old hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, gazing into the flames as they danced in the hearth. He had lived here alone for years, long after lighthouses had become relics of the past, long after sailors had stopped depending on their beacons to guide them safely home. But he had never left. Every night he climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, tending to the great light that still shone out across the ocean. And every night, without fail, he would sit by the fire, listen to the waves and wait. For what, he wasn't quite sure, but he always waited. The visitor on this particular night, as the wind hummed through the cracks in the old lighthouse walls, a soft knock echoed against the heavy wooden door. Samuel's brow furrowed. No one ever came here. He placed his teacup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer, and rose from his chair. The door creaked as he pulled it open. Standing in the moonlight was a woman. She was wrapped in a long dark coat, her hood pulled over her head obscuring most of her face. But even in the dim light, Samuel could see the glint of her curious eyes. "I didn't think anyone lived here," she said, her voice gentle as the breeze. Samuel studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "Would you like to come in?" She hesitated, then nodded. stepping over the threshold. Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to embrace her, melting away the chill of the sea air. She pulled back her hood, revealing soft features and hair the color of autumn leaves. She couldn't have been more than 30, yet her eyes held something old, something familiar. Samuel gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Tia?" She nodded again, her lips curling into a small knowing smile. A conversation by firelight. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside, the occasional hiss of a log shifting in the fire. "You've been here a long time," the woman finally said. Samuel chuckled, taking a slow sip of tea. "That obvious," she smiled. "People in town say the lighthouse has been abandoned for years." Samuel exhaled, gazing at the flames. "I suppose in some ways it has." She tilted her head. "And yet the light is still on every night." He met her gaze then, something unspoken passing between them. After a long pause, he leaned back, eyes drifting toward the lantern room above them. "It's funny, isn't it?" he murmured. "We keep lights on even when no one is left to see them, just in case." She studied him. "In case of what?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "In case someone is still out there." The room was quiet for a moment, the only sound the distant crash of waves. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "Do you believe someone is?" Samuel let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around his cup. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, as if she understood. The story of the Keeper's Watch. Samuel didn't often tell the story, but tonight, the words came easily. He spoke of a time when ships still relied on the lighthouse, when the sea was filled with vessels guided home by its steady beam. He had been younger then, and he had not been alone. There had been another keeper, James Holloway. They had worked side by side for years, tending to the lighthouse, sharing stories, drinking tea by the fire just as Samuel did now, until one fateful night, a storm had rolled in, one of the worst the coast had ever seen. The wind had howled through the cliffs, the waves rising like monsters in the dark. And somewhere out in that black abyss, a ship was struggling. James had seen it first. "It's too close," he had said. "They don't see the rocks." Without a second thought, he had grabbed his lantern and rushed out into the storm. Samuel had called after him, but James had already disappeared into the night. The storm raged until dawn. The ship never made it, and neither did James. They found his lantern washed up on the shore, its light still flickering weakly, but of James, there was no sign. Samuel had stayed in the lighthouse ever since, waiting, hoping. Because sometimes, on the nights when the wind was still, and the fog curled thick around the cliffs, he could still see it, a flickering lantern, far out in the lantern in the mid. When Samuel finished speaking, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly in the dim room. The woman sat quietly, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Finally she stood. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping the light on." Samuel nodded. She pulled her hood back over her head, stepping toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, she paused. Then, without turning back, she whispered, "He's still out there." Samuel's breath caught, but before he could say anything, she was gone, disappearing into the misty night. For a long time he stood there, staring at the empty doorway, her words echoing in his mind. Then slowly he turned toward the window, and far, far out at sea, beyond the reach of his lighthouse's beam, he saw it, a small flickering light, a lantern, moving through the waiting to be found.